Now, to today's program, today's speaker, Cheryl Lawrence, over here, has executive level experience in both the nonprofit and business sectors. She's the CEO of Open Communities in Evanston, and she has also served for many years as the executive director at Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, one of the preeminent housing and legal organizations in Illinois. So we're going to learn some stuff today. So without further ado, Cheryl.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this snowy day to talk about civil rights and housing. And as you know, we are having a housing crisis all around us. And for us older adults, a lot of times this could mean not being able to age where we would like to be able to age in place in our communities. And so many people are being forced out, taxed out. And so on this MLK, as we head into MLK holiday, we'd like to present just a little bit of civil rights history and talk about, our area and the history of fair housing in our area, and maybe give some insight in how we got here, what it looks like today, and where we can go in the future. Maybe some things that we can do to help the situation, and talk about some of our services at Open Communities. We have a long history. Our organization is 52 years old. Many of you might be familiar with iterations of Open Communities through time, which we will talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dominic Voss, who's going to do the majority of this presentation. Dominic is our Director of Fair Housing, and he's a great speaker. And yes, Dominic, come on up. Yeah,
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having us again. Thanks, Cheryl. So, as Cheryl said, I'm the director of our Fair Housing program. So most of what we're going to talk about pertains to civil rights and housing, a little bit of the past, a little bit presently about what we work on at Open Communities and what we are planning to work on in the future. It's going to be a little bit of a sampling of a few different kind of educational programs that we do. If anybody is connected to other organizations or other spaces where you want to hear a little bit more about that past kind of component and how we got here, maybe a little bit more about policy and what's on our agenda at Open Communities, or just a little bit more about our services, feel free to reach out, and we can always do another presentation that's a little bit more narrowly focused. So we're going to kind of hop over a few different topics today. So one of the first things I want to do is talk a little bit about our services, and we're going to keep playing the, I have to turn this on. There we go. And we have to say this every time we do a presentation. We are often in part funded by the federal government, by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most important part of this disclaimer is that our views don't necessarily reflect the federal government's, and vice versa. So I'm going to say a little bit about a couple of our programs, and then I'm going to switch it up again just for a second to have my colleague Sarah Delgado talk about our housing counseling program and things that might be really relevant to some of the community here today, and speaking about our services for older adults. So on the left here, our Fair Housing Department. I think I have a little cute laser pointer right there. We do a few things in fair housing. So fair housing is, of course, related to your civil rights, to protections afforded by the federal, state, and local law. We work as a partner with HUD and other agencies to enforce that law. So we actually have a fair housing testing program. Does anybody know what fair housing testing is? Has anybody heard of that? Oh, great. So we actually employ a whole network of spies, basically, that go out in the community, and they pretend that they're interested in getting a mortgage, or primarily in renting, is where we do most of our testing. And they'll say that they're interested in a home, and this happens all over the country. There's fair housing centers basically in every state, sometimes many, as there are in Illinois. And they do undercover work and seeing if landlords, property managers, real estate agents, lenders are following the Fair Housing Act, and if there is any evidence that they are discriminating on the basis of something that's protected under the law. I'll talk about some of those protections and what they are in Illinois in a minute. So we do that. We do education about people's rights. We assist people with disabilities in exercising their rights. There's a couple of special components of fair housing law called being able to access a reasonable accommodation or modification. Folks might have heard of those terms. I'm actually going to explain that a little bit more in a minute as well. And we try to change laws also. We try to work on the systemic level in our communities, in our service area. We cover the kind of north and northwest suburbs of Chicago. And we are trying to make it more fair and more affordable. So I'm going to skip over to our Access to Justice program. Is a really special program. We have a community navigator who works specifically with a lot of folks who have been impacted in some way by the criminal justice system. So whether they have a family member that's been incarcerated, whether they, their documentation status puts them at risk. There's a lot of different ways that folks can be vulnerable in that system, and she provides a lot of know your rights education and kind of closer case management as well. And Sarah, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about housing counseling in our older adults program?
Sure. So our third bucket here in the middle is our housing counseling program. And we work specifically with clients to identify their housing goal, and we create an action plan to get to their housing goal, a housing goal that leads to housing stability. So for renters who know that their rent is increasing, or they know that they may be displaced and need to move, that may be creating an action plan to build up their credit to apply for a new apartment or build up money for a deposit. We work a lot with financial education, and I was really excited to hear all the information about credit earlier in the presentation, because every single client who comes through the housing counseling program, we work with the client to look at their credit report because we do budgeting. We want to know what's on there. And as was said earlier, there's often things on a credit report that they didn't know about. Either it was something that was forgotten, or it's just not them. And we've seen different iterations of that. So we work with folks to pull their credit report, which is sometimes a process, but should definitely be done. And just to review it to make sure, one, everything is yours. You know what all of that is, that it all belongs to you. And if you're working on debt as one of your actionable items, if you're working on savings and you have debt that needs to be paid off, we create an action plan. But the majority of our clients right now are homeowners. And many of our homeowners are at risk of being displaced from their housing. So we work with folks who are actively in foreclosure. If they still have a mortgage, we help them with options. We work with their lender to apply for loss mitigation options to try and prevent a foreclosure if they would like to stay in the home. We work with folks who would like to transition out of that housing if it's not sustainable, to create an action plan of what the next step would be. And we also work with folks whose housing might be unaffordable in other ways. Maybe it's not a mortgage at this point, maybe it's property taxes. That's a big thing right now. We make sure that they have all of their exemptions, that we can create a budget and make sure that they understand what the responsibilities are and what the options are for paying taxes, for instance. And then finally, we also have our pre-purchase counseling. Folks who are buying sometimes for the first time or who haven't bought in a long time, we provide education and counseling along with that. I don't know if you want to go to the next page. So in partnership, in support with AARP and Age Options, who gave us grants to expand our program, we've expanded into our Here to Stay older adult housing counseling program. So all of our housing counseling services, but we're working a lot with older adults and seniors who want to stay in their housing, in their community, or need to make a plan to transition into something more sustainable. So it's all of the housing counseling programming that I spoke about, including, figuring out home maintenance issues, whether that is a grant that you might be eligible for, we can help you apply, whether that's budgeting, getting additional funding for that if you're interested in downsizing. And we now have a HUD certified reverse mortgage counselor. So Sarah Buckley is our reverse mortgage counselor. I have her stand up and wave there. We, on the foreclosure side of our counseling, we saw more and more older adults who had reverse mortgages who didn't understand the terms of their mortgage and ended up being in default. And so we wanted to make sure that folks who want that product and who are in that product understand the terms of that product and make sure that they know their responsibilities. So if anybody has questions about reverse mortgages, if they've ever considered it or just any questions at all, you can talk to Sarah Buckley. She'll be here through the presentation. She has her cards and you can contact us at any point. I'll give this back to Dominic.
Thank you, Sarah. One of the Sarahs. We have 4 Sarahs, which is a joke we like to tell. That's true. It's not actually a joke, but we have like a staff of 12 or 13 people, and we have 4 people named Sarah, and they're all amazing Sarahs. So I'm just going to dive into a little bit of the history, just kind of our organization, of kind of what brought us here in the civil rights movement in general, which we really seat ourselves within. We are an organization that is here to protect people's civil rights, to help people exercise those rights, and we take that responsibility really seriously. So I was talking to Jill before coming up here, and I know that North Shore Senior Center has been around for about 65 years. Cheryl mentioned we've been around for about 52 years, and there's a long history actually between the organizations. We've, I think, had some board members in common, family members of board members in common, have done a lot of work with North Shore Senior Center, so we're really glad to be here again. Our kind of roots are directly in the civil rights movement. As I mentioned, there was a project called the North Shore Summer Project. We can see some images here on the screen, primarily of Dr. King's visit to the Winnetka Village Green in 1965. There was this project called the North Shore Summer Project that helped to make that happen. That was essentially a group of, what we maybe used to call housewives. I think we have, more preferable terms today, maybe stay-at-home moms, and folks who had pretty, decent means and were really involved in the civil rights movement and funding it, in participating, going down, trips to, Montgomery and other kind of civil rights touch points in the South. Were really active members of that movement. And they decided, the North Shore is pretty homogenous. We have a lot of exclusion, especially racial exclusion in the North Shore, and we want to challenge that. And that was really kind of most directly about challenging the practices of the Illinois Realtors and the Realtors Association. So what they did was this summer project was inspired by a similar project that happened in the South. And they collected a petition. They interviewed people who were homeowners who were either actively selling or thinking about selling their homes, and really tried to gauge what are the attitudes about racial integration. Something we don't talk about as much today, but was a big question of that era, obviously. And what they saw was, the real estate industry was saying, we can't integrate this community because people, don't want to sell their homes to people of color. And what the North Shore Summer Project showed in numbers was that the vast majority of people were open to integration and were encouraging integration. This all culminated in a march to the North Shore Board of Realtors in downtown Evanston, and delivered that petition and tried to enact some change, and I think had some great impact. So some leaders in that organization went on to start, the name changed a couple times. We were the Interfaith Housing Center. So that's kind of, directly where our roots come from. And I guess I didn't have my slide on here about Dr. King and how, important his legacy was in coming up here. Folks know the story. Dr. King moved into North Lawndale in a pretty dilapidated apartment, I think also in 1965. And, really wanted to create a sustaining civil rights movement in the North that was going to work on a lot of anti-poverty issues as well. And he was famously kind of given a sort of posh apartment when he first arrived and said, no, we're going to work on poverty issues. I'm going to live like a person in poverty. And so he moved his whole family to North Lawndale, famously said that there was, some of the most virulent racism that he'd ever seen in his life in the city of Chicago at that time. So talking about history and kind of just seating ourselves within this timeline of important policy that addresses segregation. So our work is really, really rooted in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's what really animates everything that I do and what we do on sort of a technical level, and all the government structures, the laws that I'm referencing really kind of stem from the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But I think it's kind of important when we're talking about the history to look at what are sort of formal attempts to dismantle the systems of segregation, especially racial segregation in our communities. And by the way, this isn't the only type of segregation that open communities is concerned with, and we're going to talk about some other forms of segregation in a minute. So one thing we've been talking a lot about lately is, any folks here from Evanston familiar with, there's a comprehensive plan? See, one hand kind of went up for a second. Maybe one person here. So they're redoing the comprehensive plan in Evanston, and they're redoing the zoning. And zoning has a lot to do with the history of segregation. So there was this famous Supreme Court decision in 1917 that basically stopped governments from being able to directly segregate on the basis of neighborhood. So prior to 1917, you could have explicitly racial zoning ordinances. This block cannot be more than 50% Black. This block cannot be more than whatever percent Jewish. These were legal ordinances in many cities in the U.S. Supreme Court said no more. And then directly after that, in fact, within the next couple of years, we saw our whole kind of modern apparatus of zoning come out that said, okay, well, you have to have minimum lot sizes. Only single family homes can be in this neighborhood. And what that really did was had the effect of entrenching who could live where, especially on the basis of race and kind of socioeconomic status. In the 1960s, of course, everything exploded. We have the Civil Rights Movement. We had the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which we can talk more about in a second, and then all sorts of other laws in the 70s that kind of followed up. We had the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. A lot of these were about trying to fight discrimination in lending and making sure that there is information reported to hold big financial institutions accountable. So I'm going to now kind of give a little reflection of where we're at today. This isn't meant to depress all of you today, but it's meant to galvanize us to see that the problem still isn't fixed, okay? So there was an important study in 2019 that showed that 80%, I'm going to repeat this, 80% of the large metro areas in the United States are more segregated in 2020 than they were in 1990. So in that 30-year period, 80% of our largest metro areas are more segregated, and that's by race, than they were 30 years prior. The National Association of Realtors acknowledged and published data that showed that the homeownership wealth gap has grown over the past decade from 26% in 2011 to 29% in 2023. So that's the Black-white homeownership gap. So Black homeownership has increased, but that gap has remained stubbornly stable and in fact has grown recently. And so what are the consequences of this? Why do we care? Well, segregation hurts everybody. It hurts the region in many different ways. Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. It's usually in the top 3 or so. I was just mentioning the wealth gap. So the average Black family wealth is about 12.7% of the average white family gap. You'll find different statistics, different places that you look. It usually means about a 10-to-1 ratio is kind of the average that I've seen in different studies, the wealth gap between Black and white families. Average Latino family wealth is around 19% of the average white family. There's a really impactful report that came out by the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Urban Institute called the Cost of Segregation Report that talks about how much we lose as a region in terms of people that aren't able to attain a bachelor's degree, the amount of violence that's correlated with a highly segregated area. And they have some pretty stark statistics about what our community would look like if we weren't as segregated. I won't get into the minutia in that right now. So it costs us all a lot, and that's not to mention any of the philosophical, moral reasons why we believe that difference is good, why we believe that, having a heterogeneous environment, whether it be through age, race, religion, is healthy for people. And we could, have a whole other discussion more philosophically about that. So, in speaking about segregation, again, we focus a lot on racial segregation. It's kind of one of the big pillars of the work we do. But, we don't talk enough, frankly, about segregation on the basis of age and of disability. Of course, the more we age, the more likely we are to have some kind of physical or mental impairment that qualifies as a disability. There's research from about 10 years ago now that showed that age segregation in the U.S. is often as ingrained as racial segregation. It's roughly about to the degree that Latino and white segregation persists on a residential level. There was a 2011 study that showed that 1/3 of people over the age of 55 live in communities that are entirely or mostly comprised of 55 and older. And we sort of understand why those structures exist. But there's a lot of folks that are, working against this to create intergenerational housing, intergenerational institutions, learning institutions, and there's been a lot of promise in that. In fact, the person who used to lead Open Communities, her name is Gail Schechter, runs an organization called Housing Opportunities and Maintenance for the Elderly, and is working at least partly on that issue currently. It's a really important issue. And that kind of isolation runs both ways. There's another couple statistics I wanted to grab here. There's another study showing just about 6% of people over 60 said they discussed important matters with non-family members under 36. We're just really segregated in terms of who we interact with on a daily basis, unless it's family typically, but even then on the basis of age. And of course, on the basis of disability, even after decades of the kind of deinstitutionalization movement where we wanted to have folks recognize that the health impacts of having folks in institutions who have disabilities and have made concerted efforts that vary across different states, but to have folks more integrated, whether it's in the classroom or in housing contexts, there are still severe and pervasive elements of segregation on the basis of disability. So there was just a federal lawsuit last year in 2024 against 3 states, Missouri, Utah, Nebraska, that showed that they were just essentially illegally segregating people with mental health disabilities. Around 1/4 of people with disabilities live in poverty. So that, of course, already constrains choice and segregates where people are living. So there's some big issues to address, but we think we have some great tools to start addressing them together. One of those tools is our fair housing laws. So this is just kind of an outlay of the law that applies to all of us here where we're at today. We have the federal law, the state law, and the county law. So the Fair Housing Act at the federal level, Illinois has a Human Rights Act that applies to employment and housing. And Cook County has a human rights ordinance that similarly applies to employment and housing. So there's some important protections. There's the kind of federal 7 race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and familial status. Familial status just means if you have minor children, you are protected from being discriminated against in your housing. Someone can't say, oh, we're worried about having a kid make too much noise here. That really constrains the choices of families, and that's an important issue. Some of these other ones that aren't quite as intuitive just on their face, national origin is a big issue, especially right now. So national origin is protected at the federal level, which essentially can mean anything from the nation you are from. If you're an immigrant, let's say, it could be your ancestry, where your parents are from or your parents' parents, the language you speak, the ethnic practices that you engage in. And that's a really important protection right now. It also involves immigration status, and that's also explicitly protected in Illinois. So if you are undocumented, and somebody won't rent to you because you're undocumented. And this can come down to things we don't even think about. So we hear a lot of landlords in our practices say, you have to have a social security number to rent here. You have to have it to fill out the paperwork. When we hear that, that's very, very likely a violation of the Fair Housing Act and of Illinois state law. there has to be sort of more options given to somebody who might be, not a fully naturalized citizen and have a social security number to be able to attain that housing. So these cases have been fought across the country and won. So a couple of quick things to highlight in addition. Age is a protected class in Illinois. It isn't in every state. The way we define age and protections for older adults is 40 and over. So I'm almost there myself to be able to enjoy the age protection. I'm getting close. And source of income is a big one that's pretty new, not to Cook County. We've had it for some while, but we just got it in the state of Illinois as of the 1st of last year. So what source of income means is it's pretty intuitive. It's the way it sounds. So your income is income, no matter if it comes from a subsidy that you get from the government, whether you're collecting Social Security disability income, whether you're getting a housing choice voucher, something that pays for your housing, veterans benefits that help to pay for your housing, a VASH voucher, if anybody's heard of those. Income is income, and a landlord can't say, we don't want to do the paperwork. Or we don't like those voucher people. We just want somebody with a job. If you meet their requirements for income, they can still have particular requirements for income. Then all income needs to be treated the same. That's the gist of that law. Just bouncing back to disability for a second. As I said, I'm going to be hopscotching around for a few different topics here, but I wanted to dig in a little bit more into this just to define it and to talk about that reasonable accommodation and modification piece. This is kind of part of us weaving in our Here to Stay program in the Fair Housing Department, is being able to support folks with exercising their rights, folks who have disabilities. So disability under the Fair Housing Act, I'm going to read the very lawyerly definition of what it means. So an individual, I kind of alluded to this earlier, with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So it doesn't have to be just physical. It could be a mental health issue, folks with severe anxiety, folks with PTSD. There are no exhaustive lists of disabilities that qualify as a disability under the Fair Housing Act. And if you have a disability, you are entitled under the Fair Housing Act to be able to access a reasonable accommodation or modification. So what does that mean? A reasonable accommodation would be an exception to a policy, a practice that allows that person the kind of what we call the full use and enjoyment of their housing. So I'll give you an example. This is a really basic example. Let's say I don't get my subsidy or Social Security check till, I don't know, the 5th of the month. And I need to make a deal with my landlord of, hey, can I pay rent at that time? Because, my disability necessitates this sort of order of business. That would be a pretty standard reasonable accommodation. It doesn't present any burden for the landlord, likely not much of a burden anyhow. A reasonable modification, I'll just give one more example for an accommodation. Another one would be like a no pets building, but somebody is visually impaired and they have a guide dog that helps them navigate. Pretty clear that they need that to be able to enjoy their housing, to have equal access, right? So they need an exception to that policy. And we have a whole presentation on this topic. We can go an hour long on that. Landlords do have some ability to determine what is reasonable. Does it burden them in some way, financially, administratively? And a reasonable modification is if folks need to actually modify their housing. Sometimes if folks are using wheelchairs, they might need to actually lower the countertops. They might need to widen a doorway. That stuff, again, there's an obligation that housing providers allow these kinds of reasonable accommodations and modifications. If it's a big modification to the housing, it might cost some money. The tenant's generally going to have to pay for that. And this is obviously, mostly in a rental situation that we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
We're kind of talking about this in a, kind of a landlord-tenant situation.
Right.
But talk about how many people here live in condos? No people who live in condos.
Got a few.
Right?
Got 4 or 5. 6.
So, this, people, when you have your own home, that's, you might this doesn't apply to me, but people who live in condos, you may go and live in a condo someday I mean, this also, applies there.
Sure, sure. And is anybody a housing provider? Do you have space that you rent to anybody else, provide housing? It looks like nobody here. But good to know. If you got any landlord friends, pass the word. All right. So we just kind of defined source of income discrimination, what it means. It's delaying the process of somebody's application. It could be obviously outright denying them, altering the terms of the lease, saying, "Oh, well, you get a subsidy from the government. We don't think that's quite like strong enough income. You need to pay, twice the amount of a security deposit or of a move-in fee. So because we kind of feel like that's risky for some reason, which is actually the opposite. Subsidies from the government are usually much more stable than wages. That would be an example of source of income discrimination. And I'll just note here that, just for the purposes of full disclosure, that the highest form of, the most common form of discrimination based on source of income is against people with what are called housing choice vouchers or Section 8. Sometimes even just saying the term Section 8 conjures a lot of stigma in people's minds. And we see a lot of discrimination on that basis. So I just kind of went over this, different kinds of benefits, veterans benefits, Social Security, SSDI, SSI, different forms of subsidies. It can even mean, if somebody has a full subsidy that's going to pay for their rent. We were just talking about credit a minute ago, and somebody is requiring a $780 for you to rent at a particular unit. That might be source of income discrimination because it really doesn't make any sense if their rent is guaranteed by the federal government. So again, something else that we have a full presentation on that we can go into. I just want to talk a little bit more about a couple of the kind of advocacy issues that we're working on at Open Communities, and then I'm hoping to save a lot of room. I think we still have quite a bit of time for Q&A at the end, so we can really dig into some issues that are relevant to you all here. And we have our housing counseling folks, and we have our ED to be able to help with that. Do you have something, Cheryl?
Well, I've been writing down a couple of notes as we've been going along. So can I?
Sure. Yeah, jump in.
And I think one of the relevant things, maybe for our audience here is that if you are living in a condo and it's difference in treatment. So if you're you're living in your homeowners association, your HOA, is treating somebody different based on a protected class, that can be a fair housing issue. So, it's not just, it's in the purchasing, it's in the renting, it's in the living. So fair housing is very, those protections, really encompass, all transactions and, many living interactions and difference in treatment by authority. Just put it that way, because we talk about, a condo board or, so it's just important to know that it really is encompassing, and we have a lot of protections in this area. When you were talking earlier about spies, we like to call them secret shoppers. And if anybody's interested in being a secret shopper to help us root out some, discriminatory, bad actors,
We got acting skills. Yeah, let us know.
We'd love to talk to you, secret shoppers. One of the most important things is, of all the services we have, the only barrier is, people coming to seek our assistance, right? We can do all the outreach. And I think one of the main things with older adults, we're all like, we wait too long to seek assistance, and until the issue is way down the road. And so, if you know anybody, if you're in a situation, anybody who needs financial counseling, who maybe, in a position just to worry. Maybe it's not a big issue right now, but things are maybe going in the wrong way, just try to nip it in the bud. Just like, your IT, there's things that you can do to protect yourself so things don't happen. Reverse mortgages, other things, there might be good reasons to assess that. If, come and get your credit report checked. I don't know. Oh, hold on. That could be a scam call right now. And another thing, just about the intergenerational, I'm almost 62, and I have the wonderful opportunity to work with a lot of younger people, friends with a lot of people my age, and I also have my parents and my in-laws who, just the intergenerational interactions can be so beneficial. And I just read an article this morning, yesterday, because today I'm sorry, but I have a migraine, so I'm a little off today. But 1% of people had no friends who they had no friends in 1990. Today, in this article, 17% of people report that they have no friends. Like, that made me just want to cry, and we hear about the isolation, and it's a real thing. And, intergenerational living, and I work with a lot of younger people who, can we say it, seem to not really have a lot of common sense. I don't mean you guys. I mean, but you know what they have? They have, like, they are so smart. They are so smart. But what we've done is we've had our kids really just focus on school. And so what they know is more narrow, but very, very deep. When we were growing up, we had to take care of ourselves and a lot of other people at a very young age. And we made a lot of executive decisions. So we're not as deep in what we know, but we're very broad. And we have a lot of life skills that younger people may not have. So the intergenerational brings, the wisdom of life skills and everyday, how to iron shirts and all kind of, you name it. I'm just saying, a lot of life skills with a lot of technical skills that it takes to interact today. So I'm all for, intergenerational opportunities. And I want to thank everybody and I want to thank Bob for letting us come today and go.
Sure, we're not quite done yet.
I know,
but
we should be.
yes, we're gonna wrap it up here in a second. Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, that's a lot of good insights there. So again, I was going to say kind of a word about all our policy work. And this, I think, pertains to every population. Cheryl mentioned this at the outset, that we have a drastic shortage of housing in the United States. I think everybody knows that. And it's really housing for all types of people. To be frank, there's even shortages of housing for people of higher income, for median income, especially for folks of lower income. It's severe. I won't get into the kind of minutia of this particular law, which gets a little complex, but just know that there is a requirement in the state of Illinois, and this law was just amended to become a little stronger last year, that requires that every municipality, no matter, I don't know if folks have heard of this home rule thing where municipalities can do what they want. This law applies to all municipalities that are over 1,000 people in the state of Illinois, have to have at least 10% of their housing stock be affordable. When we're talking about single family homes, affordable means that affordable to somebody making 80% of the area median income or less, I believe. So they have to make plans, these municipalities, Northfield being one of them. I think that is on the list, right, Eve? I think. So, they have to make plans that, discuss ideas for expanding the affordable housing stock. It could be community land trusts, which are a great model that we could talk about at length. It could be flexing their zoning to make it more flexible about what can be built where. It can actually be investing in housing counseling programs is one of the things that is an option that's kind of offered in the law to help create more affordable housing, more financial education, goes hand in hand. So this is something that we are looking for people who are, we like to call YIMBYs, yes in my backyard. We need more development, flexible zoning, and affordable housing. If you guys are interested and anybody's interested in being part of those conversations and being part of a coalition to push for more affordable housing, please let us know. We'd be happy to get your information, follow up with you, and we got Zoom meetings, we got get-togethers, we got ways to fight for this. We're really focused in Evanston at the moment, but this is going to be a movement that goes much far beyond the Evanston area.
And should we define like affordable housing?
Sure, I mean affordable.
Well, go ahead.
Well, it's the general rule of thumb is affordable is not paying any more than 30% of your income towards your housing. That's the most basic kind of definition. But of course, that lots of different stratas of income levels there.
So really, what we're talking about in today's world is more affordable housing options that meet the needs of people throughout their, to meet the needs of their needs through their lifeline, right? So through different stages in life, living in Evanston, we're talking a lot about zoning right now, and a lot of people, R1 is our single family, housing, and I've talked to so many people that were able to buy a single family house in Evanston because they started out in a townhouse, in a condo, young family. They rented, then they bought a condo, moved up through. And then, then when we have downsizing, right? So it's not just about, there's stigma to the term affordable housing, but we need to look at it in a different way because we all have children, grandchildren, parents who, just in different stages of life need something different. So we just need a lot more housing options. And if we were building housing and housing options that we were prior to the financial crisis, we would still have housing issues. We would still have fair housing issues, but we would have the supply of housing we needed. But we are building not even a tenth of what we were building prior to the financial crisis. So, there's just a housing shortage that is simply not sustainable. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great
commentary, but I think just for, some context and, why it's so desperate up here.
Yeah, and affordable housing doesn't look like, I think, what the stigma carries for a lot of people, that it's going to be high rises that are sort of set back from communities and concentrated poverty. We of course need to help folks of low income, but affordable housing looks a lot of different ways. It looks like community land trusts. It looks like inclusionary housing ordinances where new developments are required to have some of their units be affordable. There's a whole lot of things to talk about there, and a lot of ways to fight for that effort. So just in closing, this is my last slide, just kind of ways that you can help fight for fair housing, just a few ideas out of hundreds probably. But again, furthering fair and affordable housing, there's ways we can connect with you directly to take action steps to do that in our local communities. Helping to enforce anti-discrimination laws like the Fair Housing Act that we talked about today. Exercising your own fair housing rights. Let's see, supporting integrated intergenerational housing, work and schooling settings, supporting community members with aging in place. That's something we want to talk about a lot, especially in our housing counseling department. And really kind of spreading some education and awareness of the kind of historic segregation that I talked about towards the top, and ways to dismantle that history. So again, we can offer a fuller kind of review of how we got here. A book I always recommend to folks is The Color of Law, who's not familiar with the history of segregationist housing policy in the United States, and it's a really eye-opening read. And join our newsletter, and become a part of Open Communities. Little QR that I hope will take you to the newsletter sign up page. And thank you all so much for allowing us to come, and we can move to Q&A.
I just want to say that if you are unable to use the QR code or it's not working, I have a physical sign-up sheet for newsletters if you're interested in being a tester, which is our secret shopper, or volunteering. I can pass this around as well.
Questions?
I have a question. I want to ask about, they're building condos in Old Orchard and they seem to be arguing about affordable housing. Didn't you say they have to make it 10%? Or is that just some areas?
Is that in Skokie?
Yes, it's in Skokie.
Right, Old Orchard and Skokie, yeah. There is no inclusionary housing ordinance in Skokie, I think. Or they narrowly passed one with really, I can't remember, it's got pretty weak required 2%. There was the development that happened at the mall that got passed. There was some procedural issue that they were not required. It was passed after
the negotiation was
Right.
made for the mall.
I think advocates did get 2%. They got some agreement out of those developers. It's pretty minimal, but it's better than nothing. So
Part of the issue is that there's buyouts, right? It's like a developer can choose to buy out instead of actually include the units, and it's this stigma, that inclusionary ordinances are so important, and zoning changes when they're proposed, we need to try to look beyond, what it might do for, our particular property individually, just because, we need the density and we're looking for ways. And, and of course, Old Orchard is not necessarily helping affordable housing. However, there's always the building technicalities, right? That I don't know if that's really answering your question. The developers will say, no, I don't want to build that. Here's your $3 million. Go do, find affordable housing options, somewhere else. And, if we've just kicked this down the road so many times, like right now we're dealing with, developers will say, they'll negotiate a deal that says, okay, it's affordable for, 15 years. Well, at this age, we know 15 years goes by in a blink. And open communities, we're talking about land trusts, community land trusts. We're working with a partner called Community Partners for Affordable Housing, and why this is important. So we won a big lawsuit against Fannie Mae and how they handled the foreclosure crisis, and part of that gave us community funds. We are using part of our community funds to invest in a community land trust property with the city of Evanston and community partners. We are donating $185,000 to rehab a house that was burnt in a fire 10 years ago and has been empty. This $185,000 will rehab it. CPA is Community Partners for Affordable Housing, located right up here. They then applied for low-income tax credits, which they are going to sell, which now is going to allow the city of Evanston and CPA and us to buy 5 more units of housing that is sunsetting. So we have in Evanston, we have a complex, like it's mostly townhouses, right? Affordable for 15 years, it's all sunsetting, and then it's going to market rate. Community land trusts will keep housing affordable in perpetuity because the land itself is in trust and there's caps on how much people can make. So I guess I know my story was is kind of windy, but the community land trust, it's sad that that's that's the most permanent way that we can, it is slow and tedious, but it's a good investment. And communities we're looking for different ways. We're in Evanston, we're trying to figure out how we're going to buy the 40 other units to keep those other 40 units affordable. So I was going to, never mind.
A lot of tools. We need
We need
all
a
the
lot of
tools at our
tools.
disposal to actually
We need
make
a
a
lot
dent
of-
in this problem.
I wondered if you could clarify something for me.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the old orchard, because I live in Skokie, the old orchard issue about the new construction, that they're fighting over the percentage of affordable housing apartments. Is that going to affect what Skokie's expected to provide for affordable housing? Because I know they have Section 8 housing. Does that overlap in any way? Is there credit for that?
So you mean in terms of like how much?
How much they need to
Yeah, so
provide?
Skokie's actually not on the list of what we call non-exempt local governments who need to meet that 10% cap. They're considered to have met it. That doesn't mean that we don't still need affordable housing in Skokie. And a big thing with this law that I referenced, the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeals Act, it's not, I mean, we really want folks to not just say, okay, 10%, we're done, right? We need a lot more affordable housing than that. That's a kind of a really minimum. But yes, I think that the fight really has been settled, I'm pretty sure, in that development in terms of what the percentage is. I just don't recall the exact percentage of what their set aside is. But yeah.
I looked into Mellencroft, the condos at Mellencroft, and the condo, if I took my townhouse and sold it, I could just flip for one for the other. But there's a catch to the whole thing. It's called the monthly assessment. Now, if you take and you get a huge monthly assessment, for cleaning the hallways or whatever, then you're back to square one, where you're literally paying what would be a mortgage. So you can't flip your house and go live at Mallinckrodt because of the assessment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sarah, do you want to say something about that? I know you've got more experience with this.
Yeah, I part of the affordability issue, you're right. We think about it just as like rent or your mortgage payment, but there's so much more that goes into your monthly expense, an HOA fee. It can happen with a townhome, but some townhome HOA fees might be $200 and one might be $1,500.
Can afford my townhome, but I could have flipped and went to Mallinckrodt and avoided the steps going to the basement, upstairs, blah, blah, blah. And I have a little bit more space than I actually need. But because of the monthly assessment, where I'm at now, I can afford it. But that I couldn't afford. So I thought, oh, well, you know what I thought.
About it. It's just the housing shortage is just increasing the prices of everything because, people are stretching more and more to buy what they can, because not much is for sale. And so it just keeps our taxes creeping up. It keeps the cost of every single unit is creeping up. Yeah. Yeah. But you're saying it because how many other options could you find in condos that maybe, you would have other, because there's a big difference in, monthly assessments and, in play. Options, exactly. Well, and that's, we're very lucky to live in an area with a lot of resources, but we're going to find, all kinds of ways in which this crisis is hitting us because. Yeah.
Yeah, the assessments for a condo or a townhome association are set in their governing documents. So some governing documents divide up assessments evenly across units, or it's divided up by square footage, typically are the two ways. So those are and part of the townhome, the laws that manage townhome associations, HOAs, say that people cannot be treated differently. Owners cannot be treated differently within a townhome association. So they can't change the rate based on anything, which, to your point, if you're marketing it for low income, but you have a super high HOA fee, then it kind of negates that option, right? But part of that regular monthly fee goes to the property taxes that your townhome association or HOA pays. They go to insurance, those types of things. And as those increase over time, so do those
I
associations.
know we have somebody waiting for a question. Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add a historical note because in the beginning you were talking about discrimination in housing. When I was a young adult, my husband and I were looking for housing. You could not buy or rent any type of property if you were a Jewish person in Evanston and Kenilworth and certain parts of Chicago.
So there's a presentation we give that often has an example of a restrictive deed covenant. So, restricting who the home can be sold to. And we give an example of one that's just from Lake County, just, a few miles from here that says, shall not be sold to any member of the Negro, Jewish, so and so forth races. So these restrictive deed covenants are super common. And yes, Jewish people were, explicitly segregated and discriminated against, and of course still encounter that today. It's a big issue.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask about your activities related to the reparations work that's going on in Evanston. That seems to be a new program. And then secondly, historically, is how was your work, or how is your work affected by the control housing law back in lawsuit back in 1950s or so?
Might get the second part of that, the controlled housing.
Control. There was a control.
Lawsuit. Gaucho. Yeah. So so the first part, the reparations ordinance, it's something that we unequivocally support in open communities. We haven't been directly involved in terms of providing any of the direct assistance and contract with the city, or the counseling, really, right? I don't know if you want to speak any more to our involvement in it sort of on the periphery.
We've had some of the folks who received reparations come through our housing counseling program. So for folks who don't know, I'm probably not the most informed person on the whole process in the reparations program in Evanston, but folks who had ancestry in Evanston who could show that they Black and African American families that had ancestry in Evanston before a certain time period, they were impacted by the segregation policies in Evanston, and they had the right to apply for reparations. So it was money originally for housing. Now I think there might be some direct money.
Loss of generational.
Right, loss of generational wealth, loss of access to housing, actual financial loss to the generations because of lack of access to housing. So they were entitled to apply for financial reparations. And so some of the folks we've spoken to that have come in through housing counseling, they may be the first one in their family, maybe ever or in decades, to purchase a home. So a lot of times we do pre-purchase counseling, which involves a lot of education around the entire process, all of the players. It means preparing for it. And also, what does that mean if you receive this money? How do you go forward with it? What are the next steps? So yeah, we can help folks who are in the reparations program. There also is another organization who works with folks, a couple others, for reparations that are helping folks who don't have this generational knowledge of purchasing to access that information and to really plan for sustainable housing.
I think in a lot of our kids, they're renting because the hardest thing to do is to come up with that first down payment, and it keeps people renting at enormous rates. And so, reparations, has been a great way to help people actually be able to invest in the community and stay there.
we didn't mention the Cottrell case as well, but essentially Cottrell decentralized a lot of public housing folks in these tall high-rise buildings and spread them out. I will say, I don't know, a lot of people received vouchers, and that is, as Dominic was talking about earlier, it's great because they have access in theory to more market rate housing all over, but there's a lot of discrimination for voucher holders to find housing. So it's still a huge issue.
Even though it's guaranteed rent to a landlord. Yeah. It's like, it's amazing, that the stigma, still outweighs, the benefit of guaranteed rate. And I have to tell you, countless, that our clients are, wonderful people. It's like, that they're just continued, they're forced to kind of continue in this place, and the resilience of people is amazing. But anyways,
I'm glad my question's last because I didn't want to throw any damper on it. But in the beginning, you showed a statistic that 19% are more segregated now than in 1990. Does that mean that private organizations and government organizations are failures?
So the statistic, just to be clear, the statistic is that 80% of large metro areas, so like metropolitan statistical areas, like 80% of those in the United States are more segregated in 2020 than they were in 1990. So I think that means that we need to throw a lot more resources at the effort to desegregate affirmatively, what we call affirmatively furthering fair housing, not just saying, okay, it's illegal to discriminate, it's over.
Well, they have to do something different.
Yes.
They do the same thing over again.
Exactly. Yes.
During the civil rights era, it was easier to, kind of desegregate buses by passing the law that says, public transportation is now desegregated. Housing, between, housing is real property. So it's a lot more entrenched. And, as if you read The Color of Law, it lays out just this perfect storm of through history of, policies that include, zoning, even like urban renewal, redlining, you go through the list of very aggressive policies that were instituted, lending, you name it, that was, meant to permanently segregate people. And so these things are really entrenched and in, our institutional functions today, like, we just settled a lawsuit where, landlords are using AI to just summarily, say that if you have a voucher, we don't take those, which, if you're looking for, a unit, you're just on to the next thing until you really start thinking about it. This is somebody that has control of hundreds and hundreds of units who, anyways. But the point is that in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, right, it doesn't really have a lot, it doesn't on its own have a lot of teeth to it. The government doesn't enforce the Fair Housing Act necessarily. They're a neutral arbitrator, so they leave it up to nonprofit organizations like us to ferret out discrimination. So we get some resources. It's hard to find other resources. We get some resources from HUD, and we are a HUD designated organization. But yes, I agree that, HUD does investigations, but they are a neutral party. So it's very difficult.
Okay, two last questions. General questions. I think they'll be of interest to all of us. If you had to pick the one big opportunity or risk that you see of an incoming, more conservative administration coming in. What might that be? And then the second one is just, could you give us a little bit of an idea of how the people in California that are suffering under, and we're not talking about the actors that have millions of dollars, we're talking about the people that are working class, how are they going to address the issues that they face? So one, risks or opportunities of a new conservative administration, and give us your counsel of what you think's going to happen, in a thumbnail of in California.
Well, I don't know how to answer the second one. I'll just say straightforwardly, I don't have an answer there. Maybe one of my colleagues might have an idea or something, but I'll give you my assessment of the incoming administration. There's a lot of questions around. Frankly, there was a lot that they wanted to do last time in the administration that didn't get done, much to our pleasure. Like that, there was this whole threat to sort of disassemble the bureaucracy, which is a lot of expert professionals that work in government and maintain really important programs that affect people's lives. I was just in a webinar yesterday where a couple of my colleagues with some state agencies talking about this very topic, about what are we most concerned about. I think if I'm being at my most optimistic, maybe forcing it a little bit, I would think a real estate developer would have interest in trying to help increase the housing supply in the United States. Is that being a little naive? Perhaps, but you would think even that's something that conservatives and Democrats alike can agree on, is that we need to increase the supply of housing. And zoning reform is one of the big primary first steps to do that. So I hope there can be some building. I just hope there can be some building in the next 4 years. I think I still, on a personal level, and this relates again to the webinar, we spoke with or heard from the Latino Policy Forum, which works statewide. And there's a threat to essentially, if anybody is living in a mixed status family, that they would not be able to receive federal aid. That is not currently the law. If somebody is a citizen and lives with somebody who is not, that person can't receive the financial assistance, but they can still live in a household together. So there's a threat to do that, of course, along with this effort to massively deport millions of people. Obviously, that's a housing issue, and one we're going to have to guard against. And we have some laws to do that in Illinois to prevent that, but rubber's going to meet the road. So yeah, we're ready for the fight. But I'm hopeful maybe on that one narrow element, which is a big deal, to increase the supply of housing generally. There could be some progress, but I don't know.
Thank you.
I always feel like my voice.
This mic will work.
Is this work? Okay. I would say that if you care about affordable housing opportunities, or, more kinds of housing being built, the one thing that you can do in your own communities is just, talk about zoning. It's the thing that, get familiar, because zoning is one of those really boring things. We were never meant to understand it. But it really controls our built environment. So, it's one of the things that, all of our local governments, are talking about. It's on the agendas, inclusive, ordinances, and what do they mean? And, really it just, you don't have to know everything about housing, but you can talk about like how important it is to have housing options. And, and as far as the people in California, I mean, my heart is just breaking, because, a lot of the insurance is not there. It's going to change it's going to change their lives forever. And, I mean, there's no place right now in the country where you could live, where you could have a family, you can rent someplace on a minimum wage job, even at $15 an hour, and raise a family. So, it's challenges that are going to be immense. And then when you hear the incoming administration, I mean, I heard last night, one of the senators kind of equivocating, it's like they really want to hold up, funding, oh, we're going to have to raise the debt. We're going to have to raise the debt ceiling because we're already at the debt. We're going to have to, they're putting all kinds of conditions on, receiving aid. So to me, that's really scary, and humanitarian issues should never, right, stay tuned, right? So they're going to need a lot of help.
All right, I want to thank you very much for presentations. It's certainly plenty of challenges, and I think we can say that there's more history to be written on this very important topic. Thank you for being with us, and we wish you well.